I personally believe that U.S. Americans are unable to do so because some people out there in our nation don't have maps.
Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? How is your podcast coming along? You know, I am Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show on a website, which I built all by myself. Yeah, check that out. I don't know nothing about building websites, but I pulled it off at chrisandchristineshow.com, and there's a link to it in the show notes down below of this episode. And before we get started, I want to say thank you personally for being here with me today. I know that you giving me your time, which time in itself is very precious. We only have a limited amount of it. So the fact that you actually gave me your time to listen to this episode today means the world to me. And I cannot thank you enough for being here with me. And I do the show for you. So as I record this episode today, it is Tuesday, the very first day of Podcast Movement, which is happening in Denver right now as I speak. No, I am not going to the show. No, I will not be presenting. And no, unfortunately, I cannot make it out to Denver this week to do Podcast Movement. In fact, I would absolutely love, whether it's PodFest, Podcast Movement, all the different podcast conventions, the small ones, the big ones, however many there are, I don't even really know. All over the world, really. There's ones in London, here in America, you know, all over. I would love to go to any of these podcast events. Unfortunately, it does take a lot of time, energy, effort, and especially money to be able to pull that off. In fact, I was just calculating in my head, kind of rough estimate-wise, of how much it would actually cost for me personally to go to Podcast Movement this year, this week. So I think with flights, hotel, of course, the event tickets themselves are not cheap. All of those all together, plus food, we're looking at, out of San Diego to Denver, the flights aren't that much. It's not like it's cheaper than flying to like London or something like that. But all in all, with everything said and done, you're looking at like $4,000, give or take, just for 1 week to go out there for Podcast Movement. Now, the main reason that I would go out to an event like Podcast Movement or PodFest or any other places like that, it's not so much that because I want to learn podcasting or learn the inside tips or tricks about podcasting, not so much that stuff. The main reason that I would want to go to Podcast Movement or PodFest or any of those things is for the community. It's for meeting actual people face to face that do the same thing that I do, which is podcasting. The same thing that you do, which is podcasting. You see, podcasting is not a solo sport. We're all in this together. And hopefully you have built some kind of podcasting community based around your show, whether it's people you meet on social media or maybe other podcasters that you've had on your show or shows that you've been on. It's all about growing community. So yeah, I would love to go to Podcast Movement just to meet in person all these different people that I've heard of and that I've listened to and that I've actually taken their advice. And that's the thing too, is that I know that especially in any genre of podcasting that you have, whether it's true crime or movies or golf or even podcasting like this one here, it's that there's no direct competition directly to each other because podcasting, same as YouTube also, it's that it's time-shifted content when it's been recorded and then played later at whatever time is more convenient for the listener. I know live shows are a whole nother thing because you might have two live shows doing the live stream, head to head with each other. That's a different thing. I'm talking about the pure heart of original, time-shifted, pre-recorded content that you can send out to your media host and your listener can listen to it at any time that they want. So with that, the listener can actually subscribe to 10, 20, 30, 100, I guess the sky's the limit, different shows covering the exact same content. Now, would that be in direct competition with each other? Not really, because the listener is physically listening to each one. And I do know that there are some times where ideas or thoughts or things that were said on one show get copied and sent on a different show covering the same exact thing. I know there's a ton of shows that do podcasting about podcasting, and I know that some of them actually copy the things that I have said. They've even copied the ideas and things that I talk about on this show, on their show. And at first, I got kind of like irritated, like, gosh, how dare they? But now I'm like kind of flattered to think that these mega shows are actually copying the things that I say on my show for their show. I say, go right ahead, have at it. So I guess I would be a podcast influencer. The things that I say on this show influence other podcasters to take action and actually do those same said things. It's kind of trippy to think about that my independent podcast and maybe your independent podcast, that the listeners that actually listen to your show and my show take action on the things that I have said and put in practice. I know other shows have reached out to me and I've talked to them and they've said that, oh, I bought a Zoom PodTrack P4 because you mentioned it and you talk about it on your show. Oh, I love the Rode PodMic microphones. And so they would get one too and say, yeah, I got it because you use it and I like the way it sounds with your voice on your show. So in other words, I've influenced people to take action, to do things for their podcast, which really it's kind of trippy to think about because we all suffer from imposter syndrome, which is where we all think that we are not important. We think there's no reason why anybody would want to listen to me and the things that I have to say. It happens all the time. And every time I meet somebody who has listened or meet a listener and they have said these things, and I'm like, wow, first thing I think of is like, wow, you actually listen to my show. I feel very honored and very humble to think that people actually put me on some kind of pedestal, like I'm some kind of like hero or something like that. It kind of makes me doubt sometimes the things that I say, especially when I hear other people say they appreciate the things I say. And even with all that, it's sometimes hard to really believe. And that's probably where the imposter syndrome really kind of kicks in for you too, I bet too, is when you're saying these things, you're thinking, am I going to be found out as a fraud? Am I going to be found out that I'm really just kind of faking this the entire time? Am I going to be found out that I'm just kind of like repeating the things that I hear from other people saying and I just kind of like put it in my own words? Am I going to be found out that I don't know what I'm doing here? Is that really going to happen? I think we all feel that way, especially even with our jobs. Like everything like your day job, you're at your job and you kind of wonder like, how did so-and-so get a job here? Oh yeah, they know the boss or they know something or whatever. Or possibly, you might feel the same way too with your job. You're thinking, gosh, like I really shouldn't be here because I don't have as much experience as somebody else does. And I'm kind of doing the same thing they're doing. I might be getting paid the same that they are getting paid, but I've only been doing this for maybe a year or less, and they've been doing it 25 years. And you're thinking like, well, I'm obviously not as qualified as they are. That is also a level of imposter syndrome. Okay, now that we know what it is, how do we overcome that? Well, I have 7 key strategies that can help you overcome imposter syndrome with your podcast or possibly even with your job. So the number 1 on the list I have is learn the facts. Well, probably being that you need to learn the facts of why you physically are in the place that you are in right now, whether it's career, podcasting, whatever. There is a reason why you are in that place right now. Sometimes it takes looking back, maybe the last year, 2 year, 5 year, 10 years before you are in this place today and see what was the roadmap you took to get there today. And the second strategy to cope with imposter syndrome is by sharing your feelings. Just talk about things with others. Get it out of your system. The more you talk about things, the more you kind of get it out in the world, out in the universe, will help you work through the imposter syndrome that you are personally dealing with. Now, the number 3 strategy to deal with imposter syndrome is obviously, celebrate your successes. Well, that's kind of a no-brainer, really. Well, see, if you celebrate your successes, you kind of shout them out like, oh, I was able to hit this benchmark with my podcast, fill in the blank, whatever it may be, or possibly, oh, we got to talk to so-and-so on our podcast, and they thought our podcast was amazing. They left a fantastic review. Celebrate that stuff. You can share it on social media. You can mention it on your podcast, however you want to do it. Always celebrate your successes. The more you celebrate your successes, the more you kind of can nip imposter syndrome in the bud. The number 4 strategy is let go of perfectionism. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we're all podcasters here, we know that you want to remove every every bump, every cough, every breath, every pause, every single thing that may you think that us listeners really care about. I don't think people care as much about the ums as you may think they do. So it's okay to leave some of those in there. I've started doing that too. It's okay. Some of the gaps, it's okay. Don't let it go too long, like a really long gap where people think the podcast turned off, but it's okay to let go of some of this perfectionism we all hold on to. It's not about lowering the bar or lowering the standards of quality of your podcast, but it's about adjusting for your standards of things that you physically can accomplish and get out there. Don't try to do too much and don't try to overwork yourself and try to have these impossible goals set on yourself, because if they're too impossible, even for you to handle, you're going to feel like a failure. And that is what this strategy is talking about. So moving on to strategy number 5, cultivate self-compassion. Now, what does that even mean? Well, I think what it means is that you really have to be okay with the things that you've already created. You have to be okay with, it's in podcasting related here, you have to be okay with the show that you've already created, that you've sent out. And sometimes it's very hard because we cannot tell apart the difference between our show and ourselves as a person, because we think they're combined together. So what happens sometimes if somebody does leave us a negative review about the show, we think that it's a negative impact on us personally. So you need to show yourself some self-compassion for the projects and shows and podcasts that you have been creating. It's okay. Now, number 6 of strategies on how to combat imposter syndrome, it's share your failures. I know it doesn't sound right because as podcasters here, we only want to share our successes. We only want to be like, look at me, I got 1 million downloads, or look at me, I'm talking to some big shot smarty pants. Look at me, look at me, look at me, look at me. But if you share your failures and say, this screwed up, I didn't do this right, I screwed up, I'm not perfect, will help you be more grounded and actually humanize you as a person, and that you are not perfect. You are not a perfect human being. And the number 7 strategy for dealing with imposter syndrome is to just accept it. Yeah. Deal with it and accept it. We're always going to face these situations in every level of our podcast and every level of our career. So if you can just accept it and realize that we're not perfect and you're going to try your best to be the best, obviously, and that people will resonate with things that you say and you do and appreciate things that you do, just accept the fact that you are in the position you are in today. And you have earned yourself the right to be in the position that you are in today, and accept it. So those are 7 strategies on how to deal with imposter syndrome. And just remember that even big time celebrities, I'm talking like the Taylor Swifts, the Garth Brooks, the movie stars, they all also suffer from imposter syndrome. They wonder, why are they even there? And why are you watching them? Because they kind of think like they have doubts. We all have doubts like, why are we even here doing this? Like, who is going to listen to me? And I know that every new podcaster, in fact, I've had a couple of new clients that I've talked to, they have said, hey, why would anybody listen to me? The imposter syndrome already kicks in before they even launch their very first episode. And that's probably what keeps people from actually pressing record and actually making a podcast, they kind of think they have got doubts. All of these things flood us. But one trick that I figured out early on is that from day one, your very first episode, not everybody is going to be listening to it the moment it comes out. Not everybody is going to listen to it. So just remember that when you are first starting out podcasting and you do your very first episode, and even if you have lots of planning and lots of experience and lots of all the gadgets and gear in the world, it still doesn't matter if nobody listens to the show. And you may have a small audience at first, or even no audience at first, and that is okay. Podcast success is not something that happens overnight. It takes a while. Some would say it takes 3 to 5 years to build a decent sized audience. 3 to 5 years, not days, not minutes, not hours, years to build a decent audience. And by then, you should have an audience that is there dedicated to listen to you. I've only been doing this podcast, let's say, probably 3 years-ish. So I'm right around there right now. I want to say thank you once again for listening. I do appreciate you being here, and I do create this show for you. And I know that on this show, I do talk a lot about the importance of having good audio quality for your audio podcast. That is very true, because if you do have good sound quality, or at least decent sound quality, the people listening, your listener, is going to appreciate it and take you more seriously, take your content more seriously. I do know that content, yes, obviously is king, and content is also very, very important to have really good and compelling content that you cannot get anywhere else. That is the ultimate goal, obviously. But in addition to the content itself, if you have it sounding like garbage, I don't know. I mean, people may hang around and they may want to listen because they want to hear your compelling content. They can't get it anywhere else. Yes, I get that. But don't make your listener struggle. Don't make your audience have to suffer and trying to have to figure out what was you talking about. Go to the show notes and hopefully you have something in there too. Yeah, decent audio. And I'm not talking about studio radio station quality audio. I'm talking about having decent audio quality does make it much easier for the listener to consume your content, which kind of works hand in hand. Good content, good audio quality. Let's bring the both worlds together and make an amazing podcast. Hey, thank you once again for listening. You know what? If you have any problems creating your podcast, maybe need some one-on-one help to figure out the problems maybe you're dealing with, you always email me at podcasticaudio@gmail.com, and I will respond with my best answers to try to figure out the problems that you might be having with your show. And I'll catch you on the next episode. Thank you for listening.